May 1939. The night presses against the windows of a New York print shop, and the scent of ink and paper fills the air. Machines hum in the background, rolling out thin pages that will soon find their way into drugstores, newsstands, and the hands of curious readers. On one of those pages, hidden among dozens of comic panels, a figure steps from shadow into legend. He moves across the rooftops of a city that doesn't yet have a name. A cape flows behind him like smoke, and a pair of eyes, blank, white, unblinking, shine from beneath a dark cowl. The world has never seen him before, but in that instant, a myth takes form. He is called the Batman. No one could have imagined how far this shadow would travel. Within a few years, he would leap from pulp paper to radio, from radio to television, and from television to the silver screen. But tonight, in 1939, he is still just an idea, a collection of lines drawn by hand, born from imagination and ink. This is the beginning of the world's most enduring symbol of justice and fear. Yet the story of how Batman's first suit came to life is stranger, deeper, and more human than anyone ever told. It is a story of two men, one who signed his name and became famous, and one who didn't and nearly vanished from history. It is the story of a partnership between an artist and a writer who built a legend from scratch, not in a boardroom, but in a small room filled with cigarette smoke and the faint hum of city traffic. In that room, everything that would define Batman, the dark colors, the pointed ears, the blank eyes, began as a conversation. A single question started it all. What if fear could be used for good? What if darkness itself could become a weapon of justice? That question would lead to sketches, rewrites, arguments, and discoveries that would shape the very language of superheroes for generations. Because before Batman became a legend, he was simply a problem waiting to be solved. The year was 1939, and the young artist Bob Kane had been told to come up with a new hero. Something that could capture the same lightning Superman had brought the year before. The company wanted bright colors, simple shapes, and spectacle. But what emerged from Kane's pencil was the opposite. What emerged was a ghost of a man, wrapped in black and gray, moving through shadow like a whisper of fear. That contradiction, a hero who hid in darkness instead of sunlight, became the foundation of everything Batman would ever be. The first time readers saw him, they didn't know his name, his story, or his pain. They only saw the silhouette, a symbol half human, half night. The comic that introduced him, Detective Comics number 27, was just another issue on a crowded shelf, but something about it felt different. There was a mood, a sense of mystery, a quiet tension that drew readers in. They didn't realize it yet, but they were witnessing the birth of an idea that would never die. Behind that idea were real people. Bob Kane, barely more than a teenager, full of ambition and energy, and Bill Finger, the writer whose imagination would give life and logic to every line. One had the vision of a bat spreading its wings against a night sky. The other understood what that image meant. Together they created not just a hero, but a world. This story is about how that world began. The smells, the sounds, the fears, and the dreams that shaped Batman's first design. It is about how an artist's sketch and a writer's words merged to form a cultural icon that still stands unshaken after 8 decades. But more than anything, this story is about transformation. How grief becomes strength, how imagination turns paper into myth, and how one dark idea from 1939 continues to echo through every generation that followed. Somewhere in those old pages lies a secret, a forgotten truth about why the first Batsuit was drawn the way it was, why the colors were chosen, why the mask covered the eyes, why this particular design felt eternal. Tonight we'll trace that secret from its first line of ink to the legacy it created. So sit back, take a breath, and let the darkness unfold slowly. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a costume, it's about the birth of something eternal. Because in the pages of a 10-cent comic, a shadow took its first step into history, and that shadow would never leave the night again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Spring, 1939. The wind in New York carries the smell of rain and industry. Streetcars rattle past, and the city hums with invention. Inside a small office at 480 Lexington Avenue, the headquarters of National Allied Publications, a young artist hunches over his desk. He works quietly, his hands stained with graphite, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows. This is Bob Kane, and he's about to draw something that will outlive him by a century. The office is a cluttered room filled with cigarette smoke, the constant scratching of pencils, and the smell of glue and paper. Other artists around him work on adventure comics, crime serials, and science fiction tales. None of them know that history is about to shift at that very desk. Bob Kane's assignment is simple: create a new masked hero. The company wants another Superman. Something bold, bright, and easy to sell. But Kane isn't thinking about sunlight. He's thinking about shadows. He sketches a figure with wings. A man dressed in red and black, wearing a small mask and a tight suit. He calls him Batman. The drawing is energetic but awkward, almost cartoonish. The wings are stiff, more mechanical than living. The design looks heroic, but it lacks something that breathes. A few days later, Bob meets his friend Bill Finger. Bill is older, quieter, and far more meticulous. He isn't just a writer, he's a world builder. Kane shows him the sketch, expecting praise. Instead, Bill studies it carefully, then smiles in that thoughtful way that artists remember forever. "This isn't set right," he says softly. "He shouldn't set look like that. If he sets a bat, he should live in the dark. Make the suit gray, not red. Give him a cape instead of wings, so it moves like the night, and hide his face. He shouldn't set look like a man at all. He should look like an idea." Those words hang in the air like a revelation. Kane erases the mask and draws a cowl with pointed ears. He replaces the red with muted gray. He adds gloves, darker shading, a chest symbol, and eyes that are nothing but white slits. The sketch changes completely. It stops looking like a superhero and starts looking like a creature of fear. That redesign, born from Bill Finger's imagination and Bob Kane's hand, would become one of the most recognizable images in human culture. In that moment, something profound happens. The two men realize they aren't just creating another character, they're creating a myth, one that feels ancient, as though it's always existed. Finger draws from pulp detectives, Gothic horror, and the masked swordsman of old cinema. Zorro gives him the dual identity, the Shadow gives him menace, and Sherlock Holmes gives him intelligence. Even the early horror films of the 1930s, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, contribute to the atmosphere. Darkness isn't the enemy here, it's the setting where the hero feels most alive. Outside their small office, the world is struggling. Unemployment, corruption, fear of war. All of it hangs in the air. People want to believe in something powerful, something incorruptible. But what they get instead is a man who is not a savior from above, but a mortal walking among them, using fear to fight fear. When the drawing is finally done, the two men stare at it in silence. The figure on the page is still, but it radiates something unmistakable: presence. It looks both human and mythic, fragile and terrifying. In that cramped office, under the dim light of a desk lamp, Batman is born, not through marketing, not through committees, but through two men sharing an instinct that darkness can be heroic. Later that spring, Kane brings the design to the editors. They approve it almost immediately, though none of them realize what they're holding. To them, it's just another comic. To the world, it will become a new language of storytelling. one that fuses tragedy with strength, intellect with symbol, and shadow with purpose. Bob Kane will sign his name to it. Bill Finger will not. His contribution will go uncredited for decades, hidden like the man behind the mask. But history would eventually uncover the truth, and his words, make him darker, make him mysterious, would echo through every adaptation, every film, every artist who ever redrew the cowl. That's how the legend began, not in the pages of fame, but in a small smoke-filled office where two dreamers decided that fear itself could wear a face. And as the city outside glowed with restless light, a new figure took shape in the shadows, a symbol that would one day come to define what it meant to be human, determined, and unbroken. Bob Kane's small studio in New York was filled with the quiet rhythm of pencil on paper. It was here that imagination met ambition, and where a single sketch would begin to define the shape of modern heroism. Outside the window, the city rumbled, alive with movement and light, but inside, there was only the sound of creation. The smell of graphite and ink filled the air as Kane hunched forward, drawing a figure he believed could rival Superman. The first version of Batman looked nothing like the one the world knows. He wore a bright red bodysuit, yellow gloves, and a small black mask. His wings were stiff, attached to his arms like wooden planks. The figure on the page looked more like a circus performer than a creature of the night. Kane stared at his sketch, uncertain. It was energetic, yes, but something about it lacked soul. A few days later, he invited his friend Bill Finger to his apartment. Finger was quiet and methodical, the kind of man who saw stories where others saw outlines. When Kane showed him the drawing, Finger studied it without speaking. After a moment, he said gently that the red costume was too loud. The character, he suggested, should move through darkness, not light. The mask should cover his face completely, hiding any trace of humanity. Instead of stiff wings, give him a cape that could ripple and catch the wind. Make the figure gray and black, so he would blend with the night. Kane listened, nodding as he erased lines and replaced colors. The transformation was immediate. The bright costume darkened into something mysterious. The cape curved like a bat's wings. The eyes turned white and empty, glowing from the shadows. By the time they were finished, the man on the page was no longer an imitation of other heroes. He was something entirely new. Together, Kane and Finger had unknowingly invented the concept of fear as a heroic weapon. Their creation was not invincible, not godlike, but human. He didn't seek adoration. He demanded respect. Where Superman's strength came from sunlight, Batman's came from shadow. It was the perfect contrast, and the beginning of a new kind of storytelling. The influences behind their design were a mosaic of the era. Zorro, the masked swordsman who lived by night and hid by day. The Shadow, a mysterious vigilante who terrified criminals with his voice and his legend. The haunting expressionism of silent films like Nosferatu, where darkness was alive and men became myths. Even Da Vinci's sketches of flying machines whispered their influence through the bat-like cape. What they created was not just a costume, but an identity. It expressed control, intelligence, and silence. It was a symbol for anyone who had ever looked into darkness and refused to back down. Kane and Finger didn't fully understand it yet, but their design captured something primal in the human imagination, the need to believe that even in the deepest night, someone was watching over the world. When the final sketch was done, Kane brought it to the editor at National Allied Publications. The response was immediate. The figure was bold, strange, and unforgettable. Within weeks, the editors approved the character for publication in Detective Comics. The first Batman story was commissioned. As Kane walked home that evening, he carried more than a paycheck. In his portfolio was a shadow that would stretch across history. He couldn't have known that what he and Finger had drawn together would outlive them both, or that one of them would spend half a lifetime in the dark before being given credit for his part in it. For now, there was only excitement, the thrill of creation, the promise of something new. The paper in Kane's hands held more than a hero. It held the birth of an idea that would come to define how courage could wear the mask of fear. When Detective Comics number 27 appeared on shelves in May of 1939, no one noticed anything remarkable about it. The cover featured a figure in gray and black swinging across a skyline, a mysterious man rescuing another from danger. Above it, the title read, "The Batman." Most readers didn't know that this simple introduction would soon alter the course of pop culture forever. The story inside was called The Case of the Chemical Syndicate. It was 8 pages long, a murder mystery told in stark panels of black ink and muted color. From the very first image, something about it felt different. There was no smiling hero, no speech bubble filled with slogans or boasts. Instead, there was silence. A man in a cape leapt through the night, faceless and alone. He fought criminals with brutal precision, then disappeared without a word. Readers had never seen a hero like him. He wasn't radiant like Superman or charming like Flash Gordon. He was darker, colder, defined by quiet determination rather than spectacle. The city he protected was not a place of gleaming towers, but a world of alleys and fog. Even the panels seemed to breathe unease. Buildings leaned inward, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and light flickered through the rain. The suit itself became part of the atmosphere. The gray body blended into the night, the cape's jagged edges cut through the wind like the wings of a real bat. The mask, with its narrow eyes and sharp ears, gave him a look that was both human and alien. In one panel, he stood over a defeated criminal, the light catching only the emblem on his chest. That image would stay with readers for years. The artist's choices were deliberate. Batman's design borrowed the visual grammar of noir films and German expressionist cinema. Movies like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari had taught audiences that shapes could express emotion, and Batman's creators used that language in ink. Gotham's architecture was jagged and Gothic, its shadows heavy with suggestion. Every frame carried tension. Yet there was something even more powerful beneath the surface. Batman had no introduction, no explanation of who he was. He existed fully formed, as if he had always been there, patrolling the darkness long before anyone began watching. Readers felt that mystery instantly. Who was he? What drove him to this life? Why choose a bat? The answers didn't come in that issue. The mystery was the point. The silence around him made him real, as though he lived just beyond the edges of the page. Each movement seemed purposeful, every gesture born from discipline. Despite its quiet tone, the story was an immediate success. Children and adults alike were drawn to the strange figure who did not smile, who fought not for glory, but because something inside him demanded it. The world suddenly realized that heroism didn't have to be bright to be noble. Detective Comics had introduced a new archetype, the dark hero who walks the line between justice and vengeance. And in that first issue, the Batsuit became more than costume. It was the visual language of fear turned righteous. The cape, the mask, the symbol, all of it told a story without words. By the end of that first appearance, Batman had already captured something timeless. He had no origin yet, but he didn't need one. The shadow alone was enough to make readers believe that somewhere, in some quiet corner of the world, a man could use darkness to protect the innocent. For months after his debut, readers knew Batman only as a mystery. They saw the mask, the cape, and the relentless pursuit of justice, but not the man within. That changed with Detective Comics number 33, released in the autumn of 1939. The story began with a memory. A boy walking with his parents after an evening at the theater, a street quiet except for the rustle of wind. Then a figure stepped from the alley, a gun flashed, and 2 lives ended before the boy could scream. In that silence, Batman was truly born. That single page, drawn with simple lines and soft shading, changed everything. For the first time, readers understood why this man had chosen to wear darkness like armor. They saw the wound that never healed, the child who grew up alone in a mansion filled with ghosts. Years passed in a few panels, The boy studied science, criminology, and combat. He mastered disguise and strategy. He prepared for a war only he could fight, but there was still one question left unanswered: how to strike fear into the hearts of men who felt none. He sat in his study thinking, when a bat flew through the window. It circled the room once, landed on the statue beside him, and spread its wings. Bruce Wayne stared at it for a long time, and in that moment, everything became clear. He would become the thing criminals feared most, a creature of the night, silent, swift, and unstoppable. The suit that followed was not decoration, it was transformation. The cowl erased his identity, the cape gave him the illusion of flight, and the emblem on his chest turned his body into a symbol. The design was not meant to inspire comfort, it was meant to unsettle, to make men who lived in darkness feel hunted in their own world. Readers were astonished by the revelation. Batman was not a copy of other pulp heroes. He was the embodiment of something deeper. His tragedy gave him purpose, and his costume gave that purpose form. For the first time, fear was not a villain's tool, it was a hero's. The idea resonated deeply with an audience living in uncertain times. The late 30s were filled with economic despair and looming conflict. The notion that pain could become power, that loss could give birth to strength, spoke to everyone who read it. The first Batsuit, now seen through the eyes of Bruce Wayne's story, became more than art. It became a metaphor for the human spirit. Every line on the cowl, every fold of the cape, carried history and emotion. It was the armor of a man who had refused to surrender to despair. From that issue onward, Batman was no longer just a figure on a page. He was a mirror, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, courage can wear the face of fear and walk unbroken through the night. By the time the 1940s unfolded, Batman was no longer just an experiment on comic book paper. He had become a living legend, a shadow stitched into the fabric of American imagination. Children whispered his name at bedtime, artists filled their desks with sketches of his cowl, and newsstands struggled to keep up with the demand for each new issue of Detective Comics. The world had found its new obsession, a hero who did not shine under sunlight but thrived in the dark. In the spring of 1940, that fascination reached a turning point. DC released a brand new title simply called Batman. It was the moment every creator dreams of, the point when an idea breaks free from its birthplace and becomes something all its own. The first issue was a storm of excitement and creativity. Readers opened it to find a man who had once hunted criminals in isolation now standing at the center of an entire mythos. Inside those pages, a new figure appeared. A boy dressed in bright red and green, balancing laughter against danger. His name was Robin. He was not a symbol of fear but of renewal, a spark of hope in Batman's endless night. Bob Kane and Bill Finger had understood something profound. Darkness could not exist without contrast. By introducing Robin, they gave Batman someone to protect, someone to remind readers that beneath the mask was a man, not a monster. The appearance of Robin changed everything. It softened the edges of Batman's world without dimming its mystery. Readers connected with the partnership instantly. Children saw themselves reflected in Robin's courage, while adults saw the fragile humanity that Batman rarely showed. The Dark Knight was no longer alone in his war on crime. He was a mentor, a guardian, and for the first time part of something larger than his own grief. With Robin came a wave of expansion. The creative team began to weave a deeper world around their hero. Gotham City transformed from a simple backdrop into a place of mythic proportions. Towering skyscrapers reached into smog-filled skies, their Art Deco spires cutting into clouds. The streets below were a labyrinth of corruption and fog. Bill Finger's imagination brought every corner to life. The police stations lit by single hanging bulbs, the ornate bridges disappearing into mist, the mansions where silence itself seemed to breathe. Gotham became a reflection of its hero, elegant, tragic, and endlessly haunted. The Batsuit evolved alongside this expanding world. Artists began refining its details. turning the rough concept of 1939 into something sharper and more symbolic. The cowl's ears grew longer, more predatory. The cape flowed wider, its scalloped edges drawn to capture motion and menace. The bat emblem across his chest grew larger and darker, no longer just decoration but a statement, a warning to anyone who crossed his path. His gloves changed color repeatedly during these years, sometimes purple, sometimes blue, until they finally settled into a deep black that matched his shadowed form. Then came the utility belt. At first, it was merely an accessory, a strip of yellow around his waist, but under Finger's guidance, it became the heart of his practicality, a sign of his strategic mind. Each pouch held a secret, lockpicks, smoke pellets, a line gun, forensic tools. The belt turned Batman into something unique in fiction, a hero whose greatest weapon was preparation. The early 1940s were also the years when the world itself shifted. The Great Depression was fading, replaced by the thunder of a global war. Soldiers marched overseas, and America found itself searching for symbols of strength. Superman represented hope and invincibility, a beacon in the sky. But Batman represented endurance. He did not fly or lift tanks. He endured pain, faced loss, and kept moving forward. In a time of uncertainty, he embodied resilience. Many of the stories from this decade reflected the anxieties of the real world. Batman fought saboteurs, spies, and gangsters who echoed the chaos of the times. The tone of his adventures became sharper, filled with a sense of urgency. Yet even as the comics brushed against the edges of war, Batman never became political. His war was personal, timeless. It was fought not on distant battlefields, but in the alleys of Gotham, in the quiet spaces where human greed and cruelty hid. As the decade continued, Batman's mythology deepened further. The Batmobile transformed from a simple red sedan into a sleek machine unlike any other. Its curved fenders, fin-like design, and silent engine gave it a personality of its own, a creature built to race through darkness. Soon after came the Batplane, then the Batarang, and the first appearance of the Bat Signal shining over Gotham's skyline. Each new invention added another piece to the legend, giving readers a sense that Batman's world was growing just beyond their sight. In 1943, the first live-action adaptation arrived, a black-and-white film serial that played in theaters across America. It was crude by modern standards, filled with stiff acting and uneven lighting, but it marked the beginning of Batman's journey beyond paper. For the first time, audiences could see the suit move, the cape flutter, the cowl turn toward the camera. It was proof that this character, once confined to sketches, had already outgrown the page. Yet as Batman's fame grew, the tone of his stories began to shift. The horrors of war were giving way to optimism. Audiences wanted lighter entertainment, something that offered escape rather than reflection. The darker detective tales of the early 40s slowly transformed into adventures of science and fantasy. Batman fought giant robots, alien invaders, and mad scientists. The mood brightened, and Gotham seemed less like a nightmare, and more like a playground of imagination. Still, through all these changes, the Batsuit remained an anchor. Even as the stories drifted toward the fantastic, the costume continued to speak of discipline, fear, and mystery. Its very design refused to let the character lose his essence. Beneath every colorful cover and every exaggerated villain, Batman still moved through shadow, guided by that same vow whispered in the pages of Detective Comics number 33. Behind the scenes, though, a quieter struggle was unfolding. Bob Kane's name appeared on every cover, every panel, every adaptation. Bill Finger's name did not. Decades would pass before he received official credit for his contributions. At the time, he worked silently, shaping the myth while others signed it. But his presence was everywhere, in the details, in the language, in the pulse of Gotham itself. By the late 1940s, Batman had become the cornerstone of DC's universe. His stories filled the stands beside Superman, Wonder Woman, and The Flash. Yet he remained unlike any of them. His powers came from his will. His victories came from his mind. He had no armor of steel or divine heritage, only a human body and an unbreakable sense of purpose. In a world still reeling from war, that message mattered. It told readers that heroism wasn't about invincibility. It was about endurance, about standing firm when everything else falls apart. The Batsuit symbolized the belief perfectly. It wasn't elegant or comfortable. It was heavy, rough, and designed for survival. It was a man's decision to become more than himself, to turn fear into a uniform. By 1950, Batman had survived the first great test of his existence, the test of time. He had evolved from sketch to legend, from pulp detective to cultural icon. And yet, in all those years, the essence remained the same. A figure in gray and black, a symbol that belonged not to the light but to the night. The first decade of his story was not just the beginning of a hero, it was the proof that even an idea drawn by human hands could become immortal. And as the presses rolled and the world turned another page, the Bat continued his silent watch, his suit a living memory of two men who dared to draw darkness and call it justice. Every legend carries echoes from the stories that came before it. Batman was no exception. When Bob Kane and Bill Finger shaped their Dark Avenger, they drew upon a century of myths, novels, and films. The result was a character who felt both new and ancient, someone who belonged to the modern world yet seemed to have walked out of an older dream. The most direct inspiration came from the masked heroes of pulp magazines. In the early 1930s, America's newsstands overflowed with weekly tales of mysterious men who hunted criminals in the shadows. Chief among them was the Shadow, a figure cloaked in black who struck terror into gangsters with his cold laughter and invisible presence. He didn't rely on superpowers. He relied on fear and cunning. Readers loved him because he was human but larger than life. Bill Finger read those stories as a teenager and never forgot them. When he imagined Batman, he wanted that same aura of dread, that sense of a man who understood the darkness better than those he fought. Another great influence was Zorro, the masked swordsman who hid his identity behind the charm of a wealthy nobleman. Kane openly admitted that the image of Zorro leaving his mark on the walls of injustice inspired Batman's own double life. Like Don Diego de la Vega, Bruce Wayne would play the part of a carefree socialite by day and transform into something unforgettable by night. Even the mansion, the cave beneath it, and the dual identity all carried echoes of Zorro's world. Yet there was more to Batman than pulp adventure. His detective side came directly from the pages of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's extraordinary mind, his ability to solve crimes with reason and observation, became the foundation for Bruce Wayne's own intellect. Finger often described Batman not as a superhero, but as a detective first. Someone who used science and deduction to uncover the truth. The Batsuit itself was designed to serve that purpose, carrying tools for investigation long before gadgets became common in comic books. The mood of Batman's early stories came from a different source altogether: Gothic horror. The 1930s were the golden age of monster films, and their imagery seeped into every frame of Batman's world. Dracula, with his long cape and silent menace, was a clear influence on the way Batman moved. The sweeping arches of Gotham's architecture reflected the castles of those films. Even the idea of a man who wears the symbol of a bat, a creature of the night, carried the poetic weight of that cinematic era. Finger and Kane were also fascinated by art and invention. Leonardo da Vinci's sketches of flying machines, particularly his designs for winged gliders, inspired the shape of Batman's cape. The scalloped edges mirrored the mechanical wings drawn centuries earlier, connecting Renaissance imagination to modern heroism. In many ways, Batman was a bridge between science and myth, a being who could exist in both. The tone of the early comics was influenced by German expressionist cinema. Films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Metropolis used exaggerated shadows, sharp angles, and emotional distortion to reflect inner turmoil. Batman's creators borrowed that visual language, turning the city into a living nightmare, that mirrored the psychology of its inhabitants. Gotham's streets bent under the weight of moral decay, and the Batsuit became a moving part of that architecture, a shape designed to cut through chaos. Every inspiration came together like pieces of an ancient mosaic. From Zorro came elegance, from the Shadow came fear, from Sherlock Holmes came intellect, from Dracula came presence, and from Da Vinci came the dream of flight. The result was a creation that felt inevitable, as if the world had been waiting for him all along. The cultural timing was perfect. The late 1930s were an age of uncertainty. People were searching for meaning after years of economic hardship. Superman had offered hope, but hope alone wasn't enough. They needed something darker, something that acknowledged the shadows everyone felt but couldn't name. Batman was that answer. He wasn't born with power, he built it. He didn't save the world with miracles. He earned every victory through pain and discipline. What made Batman different from every hero before him was not just his costume or his tools, it was his humanity. The influences that shaped him were drawn from art, film, and literature, but the emotion behind him came from something universal, the desire to master fear, and that is what made him timeless. The world of the 1950s looked nothing like the one Batman had been born into. The shadows of the Great Depression were gone, replaced by the glow of television screens and the optimism of new beginnings. The war had ended, soldiers had come home, and America was rebuilding itself on dreams of peace and prosperity. Neon lights reflected on chrome cars, laughter filled new suburbs, and families gathered around living room televisions that flickered with stories of comfort and simplicity. But in this new light, the dark knight who once moved through alleys of fear began to look out of place. For Batman, the 1950s began with confusion. The readers who had once been children of the 1930s were now adults, busy with families and careers. A new generation of young readers had arrived, but their world no longer shared the same hunger for darkness. Editors at DC Comics realized that if Batman was to survive, he needed to adapt. They softened his tone, reshaped his stories, and polished his edges until the grim detective of the night became a friendlier figure. The city he once stalked through rain and shadow began to brighten. Gotham lost its claustrophobic skyline and gained cleaner streets, cheerful neighbors, and even the occasional ray of sunshine. The criminals changed too. Instead of mobsters and murderers, Batman now faced oddball villains with outlandish plans, mad scientists building ray guns, aliens landing in parks, and robots with flashing eyes and awkward limbs. What had once been a myth of vengeance and tragedy slowly became a series of light-hearted adventures. Even the supporting cast began to grow. Robin remained loyal as ever, his bright costume contrasting with Batman's dark silhouette. But soon came others. Batwoman, introduced in 1956, designed to bring romance and balance to the stories. A few years later, Batgirl joined them, youthful and spirited, while Batmite, a magical imp from another dimension, arrived as comic relief. Gotham had become crowded, colorful, and safe. The tension that once defined Batman's world had been replaced by playfulness. For children, these stories were delightful. For older fans, they were confusing. The detective who once haunted their imaginations had become a smiling adventurer, more at home in daylight than in shadow. Yet this shift wasn't random. It was survival. The world had turned toward innocence, and anything that hinted at fear or violence risked disapproval. Then, in 1954, came the storm that nearly ended everything. Dr. Frederick Wertham, a German-American psychiatrist, published a book called Seduction of the Innocent. In it, he claimed that comic books were corrupting the youth of America. He argued that the stories glorified crime, disrespected authority, and filled young minds with perversion and rebellion. No title escaped his criticism, but Batman was singled out in particular. Wertham suggested that the partnership between Batman and Robin carried inappropriate undertones, that Gotham's shadows hid something sinister beyond its printed panels. His claims had no foundation, yet they spread like wildfire through anxious communities. The public backlash was swift and merciless. Newspapers ran headlines questioning the morality of comics. Churches held bonfires where children were encouraged to throw their comic books into the flames. Politicians seized the outrage to hold televised hearings on juvenile delinquency. Under that pressure, the entire comic book industry trembled. In response, publishers created the Comics Code Authority, a self-censorship board that would oversee every story printed from that day forward. It forbade excessive violence, horror, and any depiction of moral ambiguity. Heroes had to uphold authority, villains had to face clear punishment, and stories had to end neatly without lingering unease. Batman, once a creature of mystery and tragedy, found himself bound by those rules. He could no longer brood in the dark or confront moral complexity. His world became safe, predictable, and at times, absurd. The Joker was no longer a psychopath. He became a prankster. The once feared Scarecrow was reduced to a mischievous figure, and the Penguin's crimes turned into eccentric schemes rather than threats. Gotham, once drawn in deep shadows, now appeared as a whimsical city, filled with curiosity rather than crime. Visually, the transformation was dramatic. The Batsuit lightened in color, shifting from near black to blue-gray tones. The cowl's shadows softened, and Batman's once predatory posture became upright, heroic, almost cheerful. Artists like Sheldon Moldoff emphasized simplicity over intensity. Panels filled with vibrant backgrounds replaced moody darkness. Even the Batcave, once a tomb of memories, now gleamed with brightly lit equipment and smiling allies. Through all this, something remarkable happened. Batman endured. The very restrictions meant to weaken him kept him alive through a decade when other darker heroes disappeared entirely. While many pulp-born characters faded into memory, Batman adapted. He survived by becoming what the times demanded, a family-friendly hero for a world that feared complexity. Still, not all was lost. Beneath the layers of humor and imagination, subtle remnants of the old Batman remained. Bill Finger's influence lingered in quiet details, the detective's careful logic, the structure of his investigations, the tone of justice that always carried weight even when the stories grew strange. Readers might not have noticed it consciously, but within every smiling panel, the shadow still waited. As the 1950s closed and the 1960s dawned, the comic industry faced a new challenge. Sales were declining. Children were spending more time with television than printed pages, and many readers had simply grown up. For Batman, this was a turning point. The campy adventures that had once saved him were now driving audiences away. Gotham's light was fading, and so was the Dark Knight's relevance. Inside DC's offices, a decision was made. Batman would be reborn. In 1964, editor Julius Schwartz took over the series. He believed that the only way forward was to return to the roots that had once defined the hero: crime, mystery, and human intelligence. He recruited artist Carmine Infantino, whose dynamic style could bring realism and energy back to the page. Together, they reshaped the legend. The changes began with the suit. The chest emblem, once plain black, was now framed within a bold yellow oval. The addition seemed simple, almost decorative, yet it transformed the entire image. It gave Batman a new identity, a balance of old and new, shadow and light. The emblem caught the eye instantly, acting as a target for readers, a symbol that said the Batman of the 40s had returned, stronger and more modern. The stories followed. The aliens disappeared, the magic faded, and the detective returned. Batman once again prowled rooftops, solving crimes with intellect and precision. Gotham's skyline darkened, its corners filled once more with mystery and danger. The tone was sharper, the dialogue leaner, the villains grounded in psychological motives rather than cosmic absurdity. The revival worked. Readers began to return. Batman felt alive again, serious and believable. But the world was changing in another way. Television had become the new storyteller, and soon the character who had just rediscovered his seriousness would be thrown back into the spotlight of laughter. In January 1966, the Batman television series premiered. It was bright, colorful, and flamboyant. Every fight ended with comic sound effects flashing across the screen. The dialogue was exaggerated, the villains theatrical, and the tone self-aware. For millions of viewers, it was pure joy. Children adored it. Adults watched it with amused nostalgia. Batman had become a cultural phenomenon once more. Adam West's portrayal was iconic in its own right. His Batman spoke with calm authority, never losing composure even amid absurdity. The costume mirrored Infantino's design, the blue cowl, the gray bodysuit, the bright yellow belt, the famous oval shining proudly. It wasn't the terrifying figure of the night, but it carried a charm that defined an era. The success of the show was immense. Merchandise flooded the market. Lunchboxes, toys, costumes, and trading cards bearing the Bat emblem. For a time, Batman was everywhere again. But as quickly as it rose, the craze began to fade. The humor that had once felt refreshing soon grew repetitive. By 1968, the show was cancelled. When the lights dimmed on that final episode, a silence settled over the franchise. But within that silence, something important remained. The symbol had endured, the suit, the emblem, the city. They were still there, waiting for the right time to reclaim their truth. The television series, though often dismissed as silly, had kept the legend alive through one of the industry's most fragile decades. Without it, Batman might not have survived long enough for the darker stories that were about to come. As the 1970s approached, the laughter faded completely. The bright colors dimmed, and in their place rose something older, wiser, and infinitely stronger. The night was returning to Gotham. And this time, Batman would not just walk through it, he would define it. The dawn of the 1970s arrived quietly, but for Batman, it was the sound of resurrection. The world had grown tired of laughter that felt forced, of stories that danced away from truth. The bright optimism of the 60s had faded into something heavier, more complicated. Wars were being watched on television. Trust in institutions was breaking apart, and art itself was beginning to question what it meant to be honest. It was the perfect time for the Dark Knight to return to who he truly was. The campy humor of the Batman television series had given the character unprecedented fame, but had also trapped him inside a mask of parody. When the lights of the show went out in 1968, many believed Batman's era was over. Sales of the comics dropped, the public's interest waned, and for a moment it seemed that the man who once ruled Gotham's shadows might vanish into nostalgia. But in the quiet offices of DC Comics, a few people refused to let that happen. They believed Batman could be reborn, not as a clownish figure, but as the dark detective who once terrified criminals and inspired readers with the power of intellect and will. Two men would lead that rebirth, writer Dennis O'Neil and artist Neil Adams. They met the character not as an icon, but as a myth that had lost its purpose. Together they asked a question that would change the direction of Batman's future. What would it mean if we treated him seriously again? O'Neill's writing brought discipline and restraint. He stripped away the unnecessary, returning Batman to the streets and alleys of Gotham. His Batman was not a cosmic adventurer or a smiling celebrity. He was a man haunted by loss, driven by obsession, and sustained by his vow. Adams's art was the perfect complement. His figures moved with realism and energy, his shadows breathed, and his Gotham looked alive again, gritty, atmospheric, and heavy with mood. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. The tone of the comics shifted with each issue. The villains regained their menace. The Joker, who had spent a decade as a harmless prankster, returned to his roots as an unpredictable killer. He was not funny anymore, he was terrifying again. O'Neill's Joker laughed not because he was amused, but because he saw death as a joke only he could understand. New villains appeared too, born of moral complexity rather than whimsy. The most notable was Ra's al Ghul, a figure unlike any enemy Batman had faced before. Ra's was brilliant, elegant, and philosophical. He saw himself as a savior of the planet, willing to destroy humanity to preserve nature. Their conflict was not one of good versus evil, it was a clash of ideals. Ra's represented a global view, a belief in cleansing the world through destruction. Batman stood for humanity, flawed and fragile but worth saving. The stories between these two men were written like operas, grand, emotional, filled with moral weight. Readers followed Batman across deserts, through snow-covered mountains, and into the heart of secret temples. For the first time, he was more than a city-bound vigilante. He was a legend walking the earth. The Batsuit evolved with him. Under Neil Adams' pencil, the design became sleek and elegant. The cape stretched across entire panels, alive with motion. The cowl grew sharper, the ears longer, and the shadows deeper. The yellow oval around his chest emblem remained, glowing faintly against the black. It was a reminder that this new Batman still carried the legacy of every version before him. The symbol was no longer about marketing or trademark. It had become part of his soul, the single spark of light inside the darkness he chose to live within. In the early 1970s, the stories dared to confront real-world fears. Corruption, drug abuse, environmental collapse, all found their place in Gotham's reflection of society. Comics were no longer afraid to address reality. Batman became the perfect vehicle for these explorations. Because he was human, he could bleed, fail, and doubt. He didn't stand above humanity. He lived within its contradictions. For readers, this change was electrifying. Batman no longer existed to entertain. He existed to provoke thought, to embody the struggle between control and chaos. The young audiences who had once watched the television series grew up with these comics, rediscovering the same hero they had once known, but in a new light, older, wiser, and infinitely more real. Throughout the decade, more artists and writers contributed to refining this darker tone. Each added something distinct. Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers, for instance, brought cinematic pacing and emotional complexity to their stories in the mid-70s. Their version of Gotham shimmered with a kind of melancholy beauty, rain on glass, moonlight over gargoyles, sirens echoing through narrow streets. They reminded readers that Gotham itself was more than a setting. It was a living organism, a city whose corruption gave birth to its own savior. As Batman's stories matured, so did Bruce Wayne. He was no longer just the mask behind the mask. Writers explored his duality in ways that earlier decades had ignored. Bruce became a study in control, a man who smiled at charity galas while holding the memories of gunfire and loss behind his eyes. His relationships grew complicated. Allies like Commissioner Gordon evolved from simple side characters into moral anchors, men trying to survive in a city where justice often blurred with vengeance. Even Alfred, once written as comic relief, became a voice of conscience, a quiet witness to the loneliness of a man who could never stop fighting. By the time the decade reached its end, Batman had reclaimed his throne as DC's most grounded and psychologically rich hero, but the darkness was still deepening. The 1980s were approaching, and with them came a new hunger for realism, grit, and danger. The comic book world was about to grow up once more, and Batman would lead that transformation. In 1986, Frank Miller wrote The Dark Knight Returns, a story that would redefine not just Batman, but the idea of the superhero itself. It imagined an aging Bruce Wayne, long retired, watching a city drowning in corruption. The world around him had lost its faith. Gotham was burning, and the man who once protected it had become a ghost. But when the need arose, when the city's last light began to flicker, the Dark Knight returned. This version of Batman was not gentle or hopeful. He was scarred, bitter, and violent. A soldier fighting a war he knew he could not win. The Batsuit in Miller's story was no longer a symbol of grace. It was armor, thick and heavy, built for survival rather than style. The yellow oval was still there, but dulled by battle, scratched and scuffed from decades of use. It looked more like a relic than a costume. Every dent on its surface told a story. The impact of The Dark Knight Returns was immediate and seismic. Readers who had grown up with the bright hero of the 1950s and the television series of the 1960s were stunned by this grim, aging warrior. For the first time, the mask came with consequences. The story asked what happens when obsession becomes a lifetime. It showed a Batman who fought not for hope, but because he no longer knew how to live without the fight. That same year, Miller partnered with artist David Mazzucchelli to write Batman Year One. Where The Dark Knight Returns looked at the end, Year One looked back to the beginning. It stripped away every layer of myth and started again, showing Bruce Wayne as a young man finding his purpose. The Batsuit was primitive, stitched together from leather and fabric, fragile and imperfect. There were no gadgets, no allies, only fear and determination. The story was raw, intimate, and human. It reminded readers that beneath the legend was still a man who bled, who made mistakes, and who built himself piece by piece into a symbol. These two works reshaped everything that followed. Batman was no longer just a comic book hero. He was literature. His story had grown into something vast, a study of power, morality, and endurance. And just as the comics reached new artistic heights, cinema came calling once again. In 1989, director Tim Burton released Batman, a film that would bring the Dark Knight's myth to an entirely new generation. The world that Burton created was Gothic, surreal, and hauntingly beautiful. The city was a cathedral of corruption, filled with steam, gargoyles, and neon haze. At its center stood Michael Keaton's Batman, a quiet, brooding figure whose stillness carried more power than any speech could. The Batsuit of the film was revolutionary. Made of molded black rubber, it was the first time audiences saw the hero as armor-clad. It gleamed under rain, its texture resembling carved stone more than cloth. The yellow emblem shone faintly against the chest, glowing like a candle in fog. It was a visual statement that combined decades of history, the mystery of the 1940s, the realism of the 1970s, and the gravitas of the modern age. The film's success was immense. Its soundtrack, its style, its tone, all became cultural landmarks. For millions of people, this was the first Batman they had ever seen. The character's darkness had finally conquered the mainstream, and audiences embraced it. Gotham had never looked more alive or more dangerous. Behind the scenes, the movie's triumph reignited interest in the comics. Artists and writers were inspired to push the boundaries of storytelling even further. The following years saw the creation of darker, more psychological tales like The Killing Joke by Alan Moore and Arkham Asylum by Grant Morrison, both exploring the fragile line between hero and villain. Each story treated Batman not just as a man in a suit, but as a reflection of the human struggle against chaos. Through all of this evolution, the Batsuit remained the thread that tied every era together. Its color changed, its texture evolved, its shape adapted to each generation's fears and fantasies, but its purpose never shifted. It was armor for the body, but more importantly for the mind. It was the manifestation of an idea that one man, armed only with will, could stand against the darkness. By the close of the 1980s, Batman had survived every trial: censorship, satire, reinvention, and reintegration. The world around him had changed countless times, but he had always found a way to adapt without losing his soul. The man who began as a drawing in Detective Comics number 27 had become a myth that spanned art, film, and memory. 50 years had passed since that first leap into Gotham's night. Generations had grown up with him. Children who once read his stories by flashlight now read them to their own children. And through every transformation, the Batsuit remained the most enduring symbol of human determination ever imagined. It had been stitched and painted, sculpted and reimagined, but its essence never faded. It was a vow made visible, a promise that fear can be mastered, that tragedy can be turned into purpose, that no matter how the world changes, there will always be someone willing to step into the night and keep watch. And as the 20th century approached its end, The Dark Knight stood again on the rooftops of his city, the wind tugging at his cape, the yellow emblem glowing faintly in the gloom. Beneath him, Gotham whispered and breathed, alive with its eternal pulse of crime and hope. He watched without speaking, a silhouette against the city's endless light, ready once more to begin. Because for Batman, there was never truly an ending, only the next night. When the 1990s began, Batman stood taller than ever before. The previous decade had restored his dignity, given him his darkness back, and transformed him into a myth for the modern age. The success of Tim Burton's 1989 film had reintroduced him to the world as a figure of awe and tragedy, not a cartoonish hero, but a Gothic symbol of fear and resilience. Audiences were no longer laughing, they were watching in silence, mesmerized. The Dark Knight had reclaimed his throne, and he wasn't giving it up again. But greatness comes with weight. The 1990s would test Batman in ways no decade had before. The shadow he had built for himself would grow longer, and the legend would expand across every medium: comics, television, animation, film, and games. For the first time, Batman was no longer one version of a hero, he became many, each one reflecting a different truth about the same man in the mask. The decade began in a blaze of innovation. In 1992, Batman the Animated Series premiered on television, and nothing would ever be the same. It was unlike anything audiences had seen. The animation was painted on black paper instead of white, giving every frame depth and texture. Gotham looked like a timeless city, part 1940s noir, part futuristic metropolis, drenched in shadow and smoke. The architecture rose in jagged spires, lit by neon signs and trembling searchlights. The music, composed by Shirley Walker, soared with operatic melancholy, and at its center was Kevin Conroy's voice, calm, controlled, filled with pain and purpose. This Batman wasn't just a hero, he was an idea made human. His tone was steady, his movements graceful, his words carefully measured. When he spoke, it was never loud. It was a whisper that carried authority. The show gave the world the definitive image of the Dark Knight for an entire generation. It blended the darkness of the comics with the emotional intelligence of modern storytelling. The series redefined not just Batman, but his entire world. It gave new life to old enemies, showing the human heart behind their madness. Mr. Freeze became a tragic scientist whose crimes were born from love, not greed. Two-Face became a man at war with himself, his duality no longer just physical but psychological. The Joker, voiced by Mark Hamill, returned as chaos incarnate, theatrical, terrifying, yet strangely charismatic. Every episode was a study in tone and balance. The animation's simplicity made its emotions sharper, its silence heavier. It treated children with intelligence, never talking down to them. It taught moral lessons without ever moralizing, and for adults, it offered something deeper. A story about loneliness, duty, and the cost of obsession. The Batsuit in this series was iconic. It returned to simplicity: gray fabric, black cowl, yellow oval. The utility belt gleamed like brass under dim light. It wasn't armored or cinematic. It was elegant and functional, a symbol of focus and discipline. Every movement of the cape, every glint in the cowl's eyes, carried the quiet poetry of a man who had learned to move through his pain like a dancer through darkness. When Batman: Mask of the Phantasm was released in theaters in 1993, it cemented the animated universe's power. The film expanded the mythology with maturity and heartbreak, revealing Bruce's past as a man torn between love and duty. It showed how close he had once come to leaving the path of vengeance, how he could have been happy, how he could have healed, before fate took that choice away. For many fans, this was the most human version of Batman ever created. Meanwhile, in the comics, the 1990s were a storm of reinvention. The decade began with the Nightfall saga, a story that tested the limits of Batman's humanity. A new villain, Bane, emerged, a strategist as brilliant as Bruce, with the physical strength to match his intellect. He studied the Dark Knight from afar, learned his patterns, and broke him not through surprise but through patience. In a single haunting moment, Bane lifted Batman over his head and shattered his back. The image became one of the most iconic panels in comic history, the fall of the Unbreakable. In Bruce's absence, another man took up the cowl. Jean-Paul Valley, a young vigilante with a fractured mind and violent instincts. His version of the Batsuit was mechanical, armored, almost monstrous, covered in gold plating, filled with weaponry. It was Batman stripped of humanity, a symbol of what the legend could become if it lost its moral center. Readers were fascinated but uneasy. They watched as Gotham changed under this new, brutal guardian. Eventually, Bruce returned, healed but humbled, reclaiming his mantle with quiet authority. The story reminded the world that Batman's strength was not in his armor or his technology, it was in his will. As the decade continued, new interpretations emerged. In 1997, Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin arrived in theaters, a film that leaned into camp and color, echoing the spirit of the 1960s series. The Batsuit in that movie gleamed like polished armor, sculpted with exaggerated musculature and cinematic flair. It was theatrical, almost absurd. Critics dismissed it, audiences grew distant, and for a brief moment, it seemed that the Bat had lost his path again. But history would show that even this misstep was part of the legend's endurance. Every reinvention, even the flawed ones, helped define what Batman was and what he wasn't. At the same time, the comics continued to deepen his mythology. Stories like The Long Halloween by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale reimagined Batman's early years through the lens of noir mystery. The art was drenched in shadow, every panel composed like a painting. It showed the slow transformation of Gotham from a city of gangsters to a playground for the insane. Harvey Dent's tragic fall into Two-Face became the centerpiece of the story, a mirror held up to Bruce's own fragile sense of order. In 1998, another milestone arrived. The animated universe expanded with the new Batman Adventures and Batman Beyond. In Beyond, the story leapt forward into the future, introducing a new hero, Terry McGinnis, mentored by an aging Bruce Wayne. The concept was bold and elegant. The Batsuit became sleek, jet black, with red accents and built-in technology. It was faster, lighter, but still carried the soul of the original. The show's brilliance lay in its understanding that Batman was never about the man or the suit. It was about the mission. Even in a different body, in a different century, the idea survived. By the end of the decade, Batman had become more than a hero. He was a mirror for the world itself. His image appeared in every form of media: comics, films, animation, novels, and video games. Each version carried its own truth. Burton's Gothic Knight, the animated world's stoic detective, the comics' weary warrior, all existed simultaneously, like fragments of the same myth seen through different mirrors. And through it all, the Batsuit continued to evolve. In comics, it shifted between styles, sometimes armored and tactical, sometimes smooth and minimal. In animation, it remained timeless. In film, it experimented with realism and spectacle. Every version carried a whisper of history, the cape's edge tracing back to 1939, the chest emblem still glowing with quiet defiance. The 1990s also marked Batman's conquest of another frontier: video games. Titles like Batman Returns and The Adventures of Batman and Robin brought the character into a new interactive medium. Though primitive by modern standards, they allowed fans to be Batman, to glide across rooftops, to strike from the dark. It was the beginning of a relationship between the hero and technology that would later change storytelling itself. But beneath the global success, the essence of the story remained intimate. Batman was still a man haunted by one night, one decision, one vow. Every decade dressed him differently. Every artist reinterpreted his shadow, but his heartbeat never changed. It was the sound of a promise, that no child would suffer what he had suffered, that no injustice would go unanswered while he could still draw breath. The 1990s ended with a sense of reflection. The hero who had been born from tragedy half a century ago now stood as one of the most enduring figures in modern mythology. He had been detective and warrior, father and mentor, symbol and man. His story had moved through every era of American history, adapting to each generation's fears and dreams. Through war, censorship, satire and reinvention, Batman had never truly vanished. He had only changed his shape. When the new millennium approached, the world looked different. Technology had advanced beyond imagination, and audiences demanded realism, not fantasy. The darkness that had once made Batman unique had become part of mainstream storytelling. Yet even as other heroes rose and fell, Batman's relevance only deepened, because at his core, he wasn't a product of powers or destiny. He was the embodiment of human resilience, the belief that one person's will can stand against the impossible. As the century turned, a quiet image lingered. A man standing on the edge of a skyscraper, cape rippling in the wind, watching the city below. The same pose that had appeared on the cover of Detective Comics number 27, the same silhouette that had watched over Gotham for generations. His tools had changed, his enemies had evolved, but his purpose was eternal. The Batsuit, too, had come full circle. The black had returned, deeper than ever. The yellow oval still gleamed on some versions, while others abandoned it for pure shadow. The fabric had become armor. The armor had become legend. It was no longer just protection, it was transformation, the physical proof that pain can become purpose. And so, as the lights of the 20th century dimmed, the legend of Batman stood unbroken. 50 years earlier, he had been a mystery drawn in ink. Now he was a universal myth, translated into every language, recognized in every culture. A story of fear and courage, of grief and endurance, of what happens when one man decides that enough is enough. Gotham, timeless as ever, still breathed in the darkness. Its streets shimmered with rain. Its skyline pulsed with light. Somewhere within that endless maze of stone and shadow, a single figure moved, silent, steady, eternal. The bat signal still burned across the clouds, not as a call for help, but as a reminder that the night was watched, that order still had a guardian. And though the world outside had changed beyond recognition, one truth had not. The legend of Batman was never about victory. It was about persistence. And as the new century waited beyond the horizon, the Dark Knight remained, the eternal silhouette on the rooftop, watching, waiting, and ready for the next chapter of the night. The new millennium arrived quietly, but its shadows carried promise. The world had changed again, faster, colder, more connected. The cities of glass and steel that once belonged to imagination had become real. Technology ruled the age, and fear had taken new shapes. Batman, the eternal guardian of a fictional Gotham, now stood at the edge of a century defined by chaos that felt frighteningly real. It was time for him to evolve once more. The 1990s had left behind a divided legacy. The animated series had shown the world the emotional depth of the character, while the later films had reduced him to spectacle. By 2000, the idea of Batman was in crisis. The costume had become parody, the tone too exaggerated, the myth stretched thin by imitation. Audiences still loved him, but they no longer believed in him. DC Comics faced a question that haunted the franchise for the second time in its history. What does Batman mean in a world that has already seen everything? The answer came not in words, but in silence. In a film that would strip the legend to its bones and rebuild it piece by piece. In 2005, Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins changed everything. It wasn't a superhero movie in the traditional sense. It was a character study disguised as myth, a crime drama wrapped in philosophy. Nolan didn't just want to tell Batman's story, he wanted to explain him. The film began not in Gotham, but in exile. It followed Bruce Wayne's years of wandering, the years between his vow as a child and his return as a man. It showed him learning, failing, and finally understanding what it meant to become something more than himself. This version of Bruce was grounded in realism. His fear wasn't symbolic, it was human. His transformation into Batman wasn't an accident of fate, but the result of deliberate creation. He built himself from nothing, piece by piece, with discipline and obsession. When Bruce returned to Gotham, he was not seeking revenge anymore. He sought balance. Justice that existed beyond anger. That balance would become the defining theme of Nolan's trilogy. The Batsuit in Batman Begins was unlike anything seen before. Gone were the bright ovals and clean fabrics. This was armor, practical, functional, designed for survival. Every plate had a purpose. The cape, inspired by memory cloth technology, could stiffen into wings. The cowl was no longer a hood but a helmet molded for combat. It wasn't about intimidation alone. It was about protection, strategy, and fear used with precision. When Bruce stood in the mirror, fully suited for the first time, the moment carried more weight than spectacle. The suit wasn't just clothing. It was his vow made visible. For the first time, audiences could imagine how a man could truly become the Batman. Christian Bale's performance gave the character dimension that no film had captured before. His Bruce Wayne was a mask of calm, his Batman a storm of control. The voice, rough and animalistic, became a symbol of separation between the man and the myth. The duality was clear. Bruce Wayne was the illusion. Batman was the truth. The film's success redefined the superhero genre itself. It grounded fantasy in logic, blending realism with myth without losing the poetry that made the character eternal. The world didn't just accept this darker vision, it embraced it. 3 years later, The Dark Knight arrived, and with it came one of the greatest cinematic achievements of all time. The film expanded on the themes of chaos and order, morality and sacrifice. Gotham no longer felt like a backdrop. It was a living organism, a reflection of human nature itself. Heath Ledger's Joker was not just a villain. He was an idea, an embodiment of anarchy. His scars, his smudged makeup, his shifting stories of origin, everything about him was designed to reject order. He wanted to prove that morality was a lie, that even the noblest could break under the right pressure. Batman's struggle in this film was not physical. It was moral. He faced the question of how far he could go before becoming what he fought against. The Batsuit evolved again, lighter and more flexible, designed for mobility. It symbolized adaptation, the constant evolution of a man learning from pain. The film's tone was precise, its pacing relentless. Every moment carried the tension of inevitability. The interrogation scene between Batman and the Joker became one of cinema's most powerful images. Two philosophies clashing in a room lit by a single lamp. One believed in control through fear, the other believed in freedom through chaos. When the film ended, Batman had won nothing. He had saved the city, but at the cost of his name. He took the blame for Harvey Dent's crimes to preserve Gotham's hope. In doing so, he became what he had always feared, a villain in the eyes of those he protected. The story closed not with victory, but with sacrifice. The last image was a man running into darkness, chased by the world he had saved. The Dark Knight was more than a movie. It was a meditation on the price of heroism in a world without absolutes. It elevated Batman beyond genre. Critics compared it to crime epics and tragedies. It earned 2 Oscars and changed how Hollywood viewed comic book adaptations forever. 4 years later, Nolan completed his trilogy with The Dark Knight Rises. Set 8 years after the events of the previous film, it depicted an older, broken Bruce Wayne, a man who had lost purpose and strength. Gotham had found peace, but at a cost. Beneath the illusion of order, corruption still thrived. When a new enemy, Bane, emerged to tear the city apart, Bruce was forced to face not just his enemies, but his own limits. This was the story of Rebirth. The Batsuit, now more advanced and scarred by time, became a symbol of endurance. Every dent, every scratch told a story. Bane broke Bruce's body, just as he had in the comics decades earlier. But the film used that pain to tell a deeper truth. that every legend must fall to prove its worth. The final act brought the trilogy full circle. Gotham Under Siege became a battlefield of ideals, and in its final moments, Batman made his greatest sacrifice, flying a ticking bomb out to sea, disappearing in a blaze of light. For a moment, the world believed the Bat was gone, but Nolan left the ending open, a quiet glimpse of peace, of Bruce Wayne alive, perhaps finally free. The mask had been passed to the city itself. The idea had become immortal. The trilogy had achieved what few stories ever could. It completed the myth without destroying it. It showed Batman as both man and symbol, fragile yet unbreakable. While Nolan's films defined the cinematic version of Batman, another revolution was happening in silence, one that would bring the experience of being Batman to life. In 2009, Batman Arkham Asylum was released, and it changed video games forever. Developed by Rocksteady Studios, it was the first game to capture not just Batman's strength but his psychology. Players stepped inside the mind of the detective, moving through the claustrophobic halls of the infamous asylum as the Joker took control of it from within. The design of the Batsuit in the game blended realism and comic influence, armored but graceful, heavy yet agile. Every sound of the cape, every flicker of the detective vision, immersed players in the experience of being the world's greatest detective. The voice talents of Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill returned, carrying the emotional weight of decades of history. The success of the game spawned an entire series: Arkham City, Arkham Origins, and Arkham Knight. Each chapter expanded the world, turning Gotham into a living, breathing ecosystem. The suit evolved with each installment, becoming more intricate, more battle-worn, more lifelike. The games didn't just let players fight, they let them think, investigate, and feel what it meant to bear that responsibility. By the time Arkham Knight released in 2015, Batman's journey across media had reached a new height. The Batsuit was rendered with such realism that it seemed tangible, the metallic plates shifting with every movement, the cape rippling like liquid shadow. The technology of storytelling had caught up with the myth. Back in film, the mantle passed again. In 2016, Ben Affleck debuted as Batman in Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. His version was older, battle-hardened, and world-weary, a warrior scarred by decades of loss. His Batsuit drew directly from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, with its thick armor and short-eared cowl. This was a Batman past his prime, burdened by guilt and rage. Though the films divided audiences, Affleck's portrayal brought physicality and gravity rarely seen before. He was not the idealistic savior of earlier stories. He was a man trying to justify his existence in a world that had outgrown him. The 2000s and early 2010s marked a period of expansion. Batman was no longer a single narrative. He had become a multiverse of interpretations. Each medium, comics, film, animation, and games, explored a different angle of the same truth. In comics, writers like Grant Morrison and Scott Snyder pushed the mythology into new depths. Morrison's Batman R.I.P. and the Return of Bruce Wayne explored the psychological core of the character, breaking him down to his primal essence and rebuilding him as something mythic. Snyder's Court of Owls introduced a chilling conspiracy beneath Gotham's history, a hidden society that had watched the city for centuries. Each story deepened the idea that Gotham was alive, that Batman was not just its protector but its reflection. The Batsuit in these tales became more symbolic than ever, evolving from fabric to armor to almost spiritual artifact. It was no longer just about protection, it was about transformation. The man disappeared into the symbol, and the symbol became eternal. As the first decade of the new century closed, Batman stood unchallenged as the most recognizable hero on Earth. He was on film, in games, in books, in animation, and yet, despite his reach, he remained the same lonely figure beneath the mask. Every version of him, from Bale's stoic warrior to Conroy's weary detective, carried the same truth. He wasn't chasing victory, he was chasing redemption. By the end of the 2000s, one thing had become clear: Batman was not bound to time. He was an evolving reflection of humanity itself. In every age, he changed shape to match the fears of that era. In the 40s, he fought crime in alleys. In the 50s, he smiled through censorship. In the 70s, he returned to the night. In the 80s, he became myth. In the 90s, he became legend. And in the 2000s, he became real. Gotham still glowed against the horizon, a city forever caught between hope and ruin. The bat signal still rose into its sky, not as a call for help, but as a reminder that the world's greatest detective still watched, silent, patient, and eternal. And somewhere within that endless skyline, the suit still hung waiting, gleaming in the faint light. It was armor, history, and promise, all at once. A man had once worn it to conquer fear. Now it lived on as a testament to what one human being could become when he refused to surrender to the night. The 20th century had created Batman. The 21st had immortalized him. And in the darkness of Gotham, that myth still breathes, unbroken, unending, forever reborn. The world that entered the 2020s was not the same one Batman had once protected. Gotham, once a city of imagination, now felt closer than ever to reality. The lines between fiction and truth had blurred. The fears that once lived in the shadows of comic panels now walked the real world: corruption, isolation, disinformation, the quiet decay of trust. In that new century, the myth of the Dark Knight no longer felt like fantasy, it felt like reflection. For nearly 80 years, Batman had adapted to every generation's fears. He had changed with the world, evolving from pulp detective to Gothic warrior to symbol of endurance. But as the 2020s began, the question returned once again: who is Batman now? What does the mask mean in an age when everyone wears one? The answer came, as it always does, from reinvention. In 2022, The Batman, directed by Matt Reeves, gave the world a new beginning. It wasn't a reboot in the traditional sense, it was a rediscovery. Reeves stripped away the mythic layers and brought the story back to its core, a young man lost inside his own crusade. His Gotham wasn't a stage for heroes or villains, it was a decaying city drowning in rain and silence. Neon signs flickered over broken buildings, the streets were filled with the hum of despair. It was a city without faith, and the man who protected it wasn't a savior yet. He was still learning how to be one. Robert Pattinson's Bruce Wayne was unlike any version before him. Gone was the polished billionaire facade, the charming playboy persona. This Bruce was reclusive, almost ghost-like, moving through the world as if half dead. His eyes carried exhaustion, not arrogance. He wasn't living as Bruce Wayne, he was existing as Batman. The mask had consumed the man entirely. This version of the Bat was raw, grounded in detective work and moral confusion. He was in his second year of crime fighting, experienced enough to strike fear, but too broken to understand balance. He moved like a phantom through alleys, blending brutality with precision. His fights weren't graceful, they were desperate. Every punch felt personal, every breath heavy with meaning. The Batsuit itself embodied this imperfection. It was not sleek or polished. It looked handmade, forged from necessity rather than vanity. The armor was scratched and dented, the stitching visible. The chest emblem was built from the metal of a gun, the gun that killed his parents. Every piece of the suit carried history. The cowl was rough, its seams uneven, its edges imperfect. It looked less like armor and more like confession. A man wearing his trauma for the world to see. Reeves' Gotham was the truest ever put on film. It wasn't a Gothic cathedral or a modern metropolis. It was both. It felt real yet haunted, alive yet dying. Every frame breathed atmosphere. Rain falling on pavement, sirens echoing through fog, the hum of corruption in the air. Gotham was no longer just a setting. It was a wound. The story itself unfolded not as an action spectacle, but as a mystery. The Riddler, reimagined as a serial killer, inspired by real-world anxieties, became the mirror image of Batman, another man trying to expose truth through fear. His crimes were messages, his motives twisted reflections of justice gone wrong. As Batman followed the clues, he found not just the killer, but himself. This Batman was not yet the hero Gotham believed in. He was vengeance, a creature of rage and obsession. He fought not for hope, but to punish. And yet, by the end, he learned something that would change him forever. When the floodwaters rose and Gotham drowned, Batman stopped fighting shadows and started saving people. For the first time, he understood that fear was not enough. The city didn't need vengeance. It needed hope. That single revelation reshaped the myth for a new generation. The story didn't end with triumph, but with a quiet promise. A man standing in the rain holding a flare, guiding survivors to safety. The symbol of fear had become a symbol of light. The batsuit, soaked and battered, gleamed faintly under the red glow. It was no longer just armor. It was transformation made visible. Every drop of rain on that suit felt like history washing over him. Decades of evolution distilled into one silent moment. Reeves' vision reignited something that had always defined Batman, but was often forgotten: vulnerability. It reminded the world that beneath the technology, the armor, and the legend was a man who had never stopped mourning. This was not the infallible tactician of the comics, nor the polished knight of Nolan's realism. This was the human being who still carried the sound of gunfire in his mind every night. The film was not just successful, it was cathartic. Audiences saw themselves in this broken man who refused to give up, who kept walking through pain because he didn't know how to stop. In a world filled with noise, his silence felt honest. Outside cinema, Batman's legend continued to expand in new directions. In animation, Batman: The Long Halloween was adapted into an atmospheric two-part film, blending noir and tragedy. The animated universe, now decades old, kept growing, reinventing the myth for every age group, from children discovering him for the first time to adults revisiting the stories that once defined them. In comics, the myth deepened even further. Writers explored timelines that stretched beyond mortality. In Batman the Imposter, Bruce was treated not as myth but as psychological case study, a man too damaged to exist without his mask. In Batman One Bad Day, classic villains like the Riddler and Catwoman were reinterpreted with empathy and moral complexity. The lines between hero and villain blurred as each character became a reflection of trauma, choice, and consequence. Meanwhile, video games had carried Batman into a new era of storytelling. After the Arkham series concluded, developers began experimenting with Gotham itself, with new characters carrying the mission forward. In Gotham Knights, the Bat was gone, but his legacy endured through those he had trained: Nightwing, Batgirl, Red Hood, and Robin. Each of them wore part of his memory, part of his will. Even in absence, Batman's presence filled every shadow. It was fitting, because that has always been his purpose, not to live forever, but to make sure the idea does. By the mid-2020s, the question of Batman's place in modern culture grew larger than ever. He had become more than entertainment. He had become a language through which people explored their own darkness. Every filmmaker, artist, and writer saw something different in him. Some saw tragedy, some saw justice, some saw isolation, and some saw hope. Ben Affleck's older, world-weary Batman continued appearing in the shared universe films, a man broken by loss, haunted by regret, yet still standing. He embodied the idea of endurance, of a warrior who had given everything and still refused to rest. Then came the announcement of the next chapter. The Brave and the Bold, a film promising to bring the Bat family to life on screen for the first time. It signaled something new, a return not just to the darkness, but to the relationships that had always anchored the legend. In every version, across every adaptation, one thing remained constant: the Batsuit. Whether stitched from leather or sculpted from carbon fiber, it was the single visual language shared across decades. It had become less a costume and more a canvas, shaped by time and emotion. Each redesign spoke to its era. The armor of Affleck's Batman reflected an age of cynicism. The patched handmade version in Pattinson's film reflected an age of searching. And every suit that came before, from Bale's plated realism to Keaton's sculpted shadow, carried the fingerprints of the world that made it. What made Batman timeless wasn't perfection, it was imperfection. His story was never about victory, but about persistence. Every failure, every reinvention, every loss built upon the last. The myth survived because it grew, because each generation could see itself in him. In the 21st century, Batman became a paradox, a man of the past living in the future, a figure of myth existing in a world of reason. He was everywhere, in films, comics, games, literature, yet always alone. His silence had become his message. And in that silence, people found comfort. They saw in him a reminder that grief doesn't have to destroy you, that pain can be shaped into purpose, that the world doesn't need gods to survive, it needs people who refuse to stop trying. In that sense, Batman became the most human story ever told. As the 2020 says continued, technology began reshaping how stories were told. Artificial intelligence, digital art, and immersive worlds allowed fans to step directly into Gotham's rain-soaked streets. Virtual reality let them glide through the night, feel the rush of wind beneath the cape, hear the distant thunder over the city. The myth had come full circle, from ink and paper to living experience. But even as the tools evolved, the core remained unchanged. The image of a man standing alone beneath a storm, the city behind him, the weight of a promise in his heart, a figure who moves through darkness not because he loves it, but because he understands it. That image has endured through every era, because it speaks to something buried deep in every human being, the belief that one person, through will alone, can make a difference. As the decade moves forward, new voices will take up the mantle. New artists, new actors, new storytellers will reinterpret the Batsuit, the city, and the vow. Some will honor the past, others will challenge it, but none will destroy it. The myth is too strong, too deeply woven into the world's imagination. Gotham will rise again in every retelling, its skyline sharp against the night, its streets glistening with rain, its heartbeat steady beneath the chaos. Somewhere above it all, the same shadow will watch. His cape will move with the wind, his boots will touch the edge of a gargoyle, and his eyes will reflect the faint glow of the city below. He will not speak. He never needs to. Because everyone who looks up at that signal in the sky already knows what it means. It means that the night is not empty. It means that even in a world that seems beyond saving, someone still tries. It means that Batman endures, and maybe that's why his story will never truly end. Because every time the world feels darker, every time people begin to lose faith, the shadow of Gotham returns, a silent reminder that courage does not require perfection, only persistence. He began as a sketch. He became a myth. And now, nearly a century later, he stands as a monument, not to fear, but to the human will to rise again. No matter how many times the world falls apart, the legend continues, not because of power, not because of magic, but because of choice. Because somewhere in the heart of Gotham, a man still keeps his promise, and as long as that promise lives, so does the night.